There are stories that reach this channel and create a discomfort that is hard to shake off. This is one of them. It was sent to me by Isabel, an elementary school teacher who lives in Mexico City. She wrote to me very calmly, with precise words, like someone who has processed what she experienced, but still needs to tell it out loud to fully believe it. If you are listening to this from your bed tonight, with the lights off, you might want to turn on a small light before continuing. And if something has ever happened to you that you don't know how to explain, write to me. I take the time to read every message. This is what Isabel experienced for 3 weeks in her own apartment, with a mirror that she bought herself at an antique market. I am a teacher. I have been teaching 6- and 7-year-old children to read and add for 19 years. And during that time, I have developed a patience and calmness that have served me in almost everything in life. I am one of those people who do not get easily upset. My friends say I have nerves of steel. My son Tomas says I'm boring because nothing scares me. They were both right until a few months ago. It all started with the mirror. I found it on a Saturday in October at an antique market about 10 blocks from my apartment. I often go to that market, not because I'm looking for something in particular, but because I like to walk among the old things, imagining their stories, the lives of the people who used them. It's a form of rest I discovered when Tomas was small and I needed some alone time to recharge my energy. The mirror was at the back of a stall that sold dark wood furniture and antique metal objects. It was rectangular, with a carved wooden frame, one of those elaborate frames that are hardly made anymore, with intertwined flowers and geometric figures that someone had worked on with a lot of care and time. The wood was dark, almost black, and the glass had that slight imperfection that old mirrors have, a barely perceptible waviness that makes your reflection have a slightly different quality than that of a modern mirror. Softer, more diffused at the edges. I liked it immediately. I asked the seller what price it had, and he told me a reasonable number. I asked him where it came from, and he shrugged. It had been left to him by a lady who was liquidating the furniture from an inherited house, and he didn't know more. I bought it, took it to the apartment in a taxi, and hung it on the wall of the hallway that connects the living room to the bedrooms. Tomas saw it when he came back from his dad's house that afternoon. "Where did you get that?" he asked. I told him from the market. He stared at it for a moment with that expression teenagers have when something catches their attention but they don't want to admit it. "It looks old," he said. "It's antique." I corrected him. "There's a difference." He smiled and went to his room. And that was it. For several days, the mirror was simply a mirror, a nice object in the hallway that I liked to see as I passed by, which reflected the light from the ceiling lamp well and made the hallway feel wider. In the first few days, I didn't notice anything. It was in the second week when I started to feel something that at that moment I didn't know how to name. A very specific discomfort when passing by the mirror. Not a fear, not something as defined as that. Rather, a resistance to looking at it directly, like when you know there's something in the periphery of your vision but you'd rather not turn to see it head on. I walked down the hallway looking at the floor, or looking towards the living room, without stopping to see my reflection as I had done in the first few days. I noticed it and explained it to myself logically. I was tired from the semester. Working with the kids was exhausting me more than usual that month, and fatigue sometimes produces those sensations without any real reason. I ignored it. It was Tomas who said something first. It was a Wednesday night. We were having dinner, and he asked out of the blue, "Mom, does the hallway mirror always reflect the same?" I looked at him. "What do you mean, does it always reflect the same?" "I don't know. Sometimes when I pass by, it seems like the reflection takes a moment to follow me." I said it calmly, without alarm, with that practical curiosity that teenagers have when they observe something without knowing if it matters or not. I placed the spoon on the plate and looked at it for a moment. "Old mirrors have imperfections in the glass," I said. "Sometimes that creates strange visual effects." Tomas nodded and continued eating, and I kept eating too. But something in that conversation kept resonating in some corner of my mind for the rest of the night. That night, before I fell asleep, I walked down the hallway deliberately slowly, looking at the mirror straight on. My reflection looked back at me, with my hair tied up and the expression of someone searching for something they don't quite know what it is. Everything seemed normal. The reflection moved when I moved, without delay, without visible anomaly. I went to sleep telling myself that Tomas was right, that it was simply the old glass with its irregularities. 3 days later, what I could no longer explain with the old glass happened. It was a Friday night. Tomas was with his dad that weekend and I was alone in the apartment. I had eaten dinner early, corrected some notebooks of my students, and around 10:30 I went to the bathroom before going to bed. To get to the bathroom, you have to cross the hallway where the mirror is. I passed by it without thinking, and then I stopped. I don't know exactly what made me stop. It was something I registered in the periphery of my vision, something that didn't belong. I turned to look directly at the mirror. My reflection was looking at me. That shouldn't be strange. It's what mirrors do. But there was something different about that reflection, and it took me several seconds to identify what it was. My reflection didn't have exactly the same expression as me. I was standing in the hallway with a neutral, slightly tired expression. The reflection in the mirror had its head very slightly tilted to one side, at an angle that I didn't have. I stood completely still. My heart skipped a beat that I hadn't felt in years. I slowly moved my head to the left. The reflection moved too, to the left. Correct, normal. I moved my head to the right. The reflection moved to the right. Also correct. I stood there for almost a minute, looking at the mirror, moving slowly, searching for the moment when the reflection wouldn't match. I found nothing. Everything was normal. The head tilt I had noticed was no longer there. Or perhaps it had never been there. Maybe it was fatigue. Maybe it was the poor light in the hallway at that hour of the night. I went to the bathroom, washed my face with cold water, and lay down. It took me a while to fall asleep. The next day, in the morning light, the hallway looked completely normal, and the mirror reflected with the clean clarity that things have in daylight. I took my coffee standing in front of it, looking at myself with all the deliberation that I hadn't had the night before, and I found nothing strange. My reflection was perfectly synchronous, perfectly precise. I told myself it had been fatigue. I convinced myself quite successfully, but I started to avoid the hallway at night. I did it without realizing at first, going around through the kitchen to get to the bathroom when it was late, leaving the bedroom door open with the light on so I wouldn't need to turn on the hallway light. Only after several days did I realize what I was doing, and I stopped to think about it. I, who according to my son was not afraid of anything, was reorganizing my routes within my own apartment to avoid passing in front of a mirror at night. The next time something happened was on a Tuesday. Tomas was in the apartment, in his room studying. I was in the living room preparing materials for the next day. It was around 9 at night. I heard Tomas leave his room and walk down the hallway towards the kitchen, and then I heard him stop, and he didn't continue. I waited. Maybe 2 minutes of silence passed. I got up and went to the hallway. Tomas was standing in front of the mirror looking at it with an expression I couldn't quite interpret at first. It wasn't exactly fear. It was more like the intense concentration of someone trying to solve something. Tomas, I called him. He turned to me with a quickness that indicated he hadn't heard me come in. What happened? I asked. He looked at the mirror again, then looked at me. Nothing, he said. Nothing at all. What did you see? A short pause. For a moment it seemed like there was someone else in the reflection. I froze but kept the calm expression that years of being a teacher have given me. Like someone else, like a silhouette, behind me. But when I turned around there was nothing. And when I looked in the mirror again, it wasn't there either. Tomas was looking at me with that direct assessment that teenagers have when they want to know if their parents are going to take something seriously or dismiss it. Have you seen anything strange in that mirror? He asked me. I didn't lie, but I didn't tell him everything either. I've noticed things I can't explain, I said. We'll talk calmly tomorrow. That night I didn't sleep well. Not because I was exactly afraid, but because something had changed. It was no longer just me. Tomas had seen something too, and that shook everything I had managed to build as a rational explanation for the previous days. The next morning I told Tomas that I was going to take the mirror out of the hallway. He didn't object. He helped me take it down, and we put it in the storage room, leaning against the wall, covered with an old sheet. The moment I took it out of the hallway, something in the atmosphere of the apartment changed. Not dramatically, but noticeably. The hallway felt lighter, more ordinary, more like a normal hallway in a normal apartment. That should have been the end. I store the mirror, the problem disappears, life goes on. But it wasn't the end. That same night, past midnight, I woke up. For no apparent reason, just as it had happened in the country house with the cold that night. I simply opened my eyes and was completely awake. The room was silent. The streetlight came through the curtain and drew a pale strip on the floor. And there was something in the corner. I couldn't see it clearly. The room was dark and the corner even more so. But there was a density there that didn't correspond. A concentration of shadow slightly different from the rest of the darkness, with a shape that suggested the verticality of something standing. I didn't move. I didn't scream. I think the brain, when faced with something it genuinely cannot process, sometimes just freezes as a protective mechanism. The shape, or whatever it was, remained still for what must have been 2 or 3 minutes. And then, very gradually, like fog dissolving as the temperature rises, it unraveled. It didn't disappear suddenly. It became less dense until the corner was simply normal darkness again. I lay there, rigid, with my heart pounding, until dawn began to break. When I had enough light to convince myself that there was nothing in the corner, I got up. I went straight to the storage room. The sheet we had used to cover the mirror was on the floor. The mirror was uncovered, with the reflective side facing out. There was no one else in the apartment. Tomas was with his dad that week. I had slept with my bedroom door closed. No one had entered. No one had discovered that mirror. I left the storage room, locked the door, and stood in the hallway for a long time, processing what I had just seen and what I had seen in the corner of my room. Then I did something I had never done in my life. I went to knock on my neighbor's door. Doña Consuelo had lived in the apartment next door since before I moved in. She was a woman of almost 80 years, petite, with white hair and very bright eyes, who had spent her life in that building and knew its walls better than anyone. We weren't exactly friends, but we had that familiarity of longtime neighbors. We greeted each other in the elevator, exchanged cooking products when one of us was missing something, and let each other know if there was any problem in the building. It was 6:30 in the morning, early to knock on someone's door. But I knocked. Doña Consuelo opened with an expression that was not of annoyance but of alertness, as if she had been expecting someone to call. "Isabel," she said. "Come in." I told her everything. Not in an orderly manner, but as things come out when you've been awake for hours and are nervous. In fragments, jumping from the beginning to the end and back, mixing details. Doña Consuelo listened to me without interrupting, with a cup of tea in her hands, looking at me with those bright eyes that missed no detail. When I finished, she was silent for a moment. "Did you buy it at the Álvaro Obregón market?" she asked. I was surprised by the specificity. "Yes, at the back, at Don Gerardo's stall." "I think so." Doña Consuelo left the cup on the table with the gesture of someone who has just confirmed something they already suspected. "That mirror has been circulating for years," she said. "I've seen it appear and disappear in that market. Every so often someone buys it and every so often someone returns it or throws it away. Once a family left it on the street, in the neighborhood up here. It lasted a week before someone else picked it up. I asked her what she knew about it. What I know is what my mom told me, that she saw it when she was young. She says that this mirror had an owner a long time ago who did things with it that he shouldn't have done, that he used it as a door." "A door to what?" Doña Consuelo looked directly at me. "To whatever is on the other side. I don't know the whole story, but I do know that what enters through that door doesn't leave alone." I asked her what needed to be done. She told me that it wasn't enough to just store it or cover it, that more than one person had already tried that there was a way to close it, but it involved returning it to the right place. "What is the right place?" "There is a lady in Tepito who knows about these things. My mom met her. I have never needed her, but I have the contact of someone who did go to her." Doña Consuelo gave me a phone number written on a little piece of paper that she took out of a drawer, as if she had kept it saved for the moment someone needed it. I called that very morning. The lady's name was Remedios, and she had a calm and straightforward voice that didn't sound like nonsense or drama. I explained the situation in general terms. She told me she could see me that afternoon. I went to her house with the mirror wrapped in a sheet, carrying it in the taxi with the reflective side facing inward, as Doña Consuelo had instructed me. Remedios' house was on a quiet street, an old tenement with an inner courtyard full of plants. She was waiting for me at the door. She was a woman in her 60s, with short hair and firm hands, who wore nothing special and had nothing in her house that made her look different from any neighborhood neighbor, except for some shelves in the living room, filled with candles of different colors and several objects that I did not know how to name. She examined the mirror with the meticulous care of someone who knows exactly what they are looking for. She turned it, checked the frame, ran her fingers over the wood carving. Then she leaned it against the wall with the reflective side facing the wall and turned to me. "Did you see anything in the corner of your room?" she asked. "Yes." "Was this the first night you stored it?" "Yes." "Normal," she said, with a calmness that was both unsettling and comforting to me. When access to the mirror is interrupted, what uses the mirror as an entry seeks another point. The room where you sleep is the point of highest energy in the apartment because it is where you spend the most hours. I asked her if there was real danger. Remedios considered the question seriously. "Immediate danger, no. What is in that mirror is not something that seeks to cause harm directly. It's more like something that exists in another plane and found a crack to look into this one. The problem is that when something of that kind establishes presence, over time it becomes more permanent, harder to move." "How long has it been established?" "Since long before you bought it. But each new home where the mirror arrives gives it fresh energy. You and your son gave it to it." She explained the process to me. It was more concrete and less dramatic than I would have imagined. It involved cleaning the mirror with certain elements that she would prepare, sealing the frame to close what was open, and finally placing the mirror in a specific location where it could not be picked up and taken to another home. "Can't it just be destroyed?" I asked. "It can be. But breaking an object that functions like this without the proper process sometimes disperses the presence instead of containing it. It's better to close it first." I was at Remedios' house for almost 2 hours. I'm not going to detail every step of what she did because, honestly, there are parts that I didn't fully understand, and I don't want to describe them incorrectly. What I can say is that the process was calm, methodical, without any fuss. Remedios worked with a quiet concentration, like someone doing a technical job that she knows well. At the end, the mirror had its frame sealed with something she applied to the joints of the wood, something dark and thick that smelled like resin, and something I couldn't identify. She told me to take it back to the market where I had bought it and return it to Mr. Gerardo, the seller, and to tell him exactly what she would tell me. I went to the market the next day, Saturday morning. Mr. Gerardo was at his stall. When he saw me arrive with the wrapped mirror, his expression was that of someone who sees something they were already expecting to see. "You're bringing it back," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes. Remedios sent me to tell you that it is already closed and cannot be sold again." Don Gerardo looked at the mirror for a moment. Then he nodded. "It was not my intention to sell it," he said. "I was left with it and didn't know what to do with it. I assumed that if someone bought it, it was because it was theirs. What are you going to do with it now?" "What I should have done from the beginning," he said. "Call Remedios." I left it in its place and left. That night, in the apartment without the mirror, the hallway felt different in a way I can't exactly describe. More neutral, more ordinary, more completely mine. I slept soundly that night, without waking up, without shadows in the corners. When Thomas returned on Sunday and saw that the mirror was gone, he didn't ask what had happened. He just scanned the hallway with his eyes, then looked at me, and nodded with the expression of someone who understands without needing the details. That was 5 months ago. Nothing has happened since. The hallway is just a hallway. The storage room no longer makes me uncomfortable when I enter. Tomas has become the teenager who doesn't believe in anything supernatural again, or at least that's what he pretends. I'm still a teacher. I am still the person with nerves of steel. But now, when I walk through the antique markets, which I still visit because I still enjoy them, I pay more attention to the mirrors. Not obsessively, just with the new awareness that objects have stories and that some of those stories continue, silently, within their surfaces, waiting for someone to open the door to a new home for them. I don't buy antique mirrors. That has changed. That's all Isabel wanted to share. She wrote to me at the end of her message that she still goes to the antique market almost every Saturday, that the pleasure of walking among old things hasn't disappeared, it just became more careful. It seems to me an honest conclusion. There are things that change us without breaking us, that simply adjust the way we look at the world. If you ever bought something at a second-hand market and felt that you brought something more than the object, tell me about it in the comments. Those stories always catch my attention. Sleep well tonight. We'll talk soon. What I'm going to tell you tonight was sent to me by Rodrigo, a photographer who lives in Argentina and spent a weekend in the Cordoba Mountains that changed his way of understanding certain places. He wrote to me in detail, with that precision that people have when they remember something too clearly because they haven't been able to stop thinking about it. If you're hearing this for the first time on this channel, welcome. We publish stories like this every week, and if you've ever experienced something in a place that felt different, you know where to find me. Rodrigo asked me to tell his complete story, without cutting anything out. So that's what I'm going to do. This is what happened to him when he decided to photograph a forest that the locals don't talk about. I am a photographer. I have been working independently for 7 years, doing everything, advertising, portraits, events, whatever comes my way. But my favorite job, the one I do when I have free time and some saved money, is landscape and nature photography. I venture into difficult places with the camera and spend hours waiting for the right light, the exact composition. It is a solitary and patient job that suits my personality well. In February of last year, Celeste invited me to spend a weekend at her family's cabin in the Cordoba Mountains. Celeste and I have known each other since university. We are friends who don't see each other often, but when we do, we pick up exactly where we left off. She was going with a couple of other friends. I went because I needed to get out of the city and because the area is photographically interesting. Hills, native forests, clear night skies. We arrived on a Friday afternoon. The cabin was spacious and comfortable, with a gallery overlooking the hill and a small river that could be heard from the rooms. We had a nice dinner that night, drank wine, and talked late into the night. Everything was exactly what one expects from a weekend in the mountains. Rest, clean air, conversation without urgency. The next day, Saturday, I left early with the camera while the others were still sleeping. I walked along the path that ascended from the cabin towards the hill, searching for the morning light that in the Cordoba Mountains has a particular quality, almost golden and horizontal, that lasts only a few minutes before becoming ordinary. It was during that walk that I saw the forest. It was off to the side of the path, to the west, denser than the surrounding vegetation, with taller and darker trees than those on the rest of the hill. It wasn't huge, but it had a compactness that made it appear deeper than it probably was. The morning light didn't enter it in the same way it did the rest of the landscape. Inside, everything was shadow and gloom, even though the sun was already quite high. It seemed photographically perfect to me. I took several photos from the outside, from the edge where the dense vegetation began. The contrast between the light of the hill and the interior shadow of the forest was exactly the kind of composition I like. That border between the illuminated and the dark that suggests two distinct worlds. I returned to the cabin with good material and spent the rest of the morning reviewing the photos on the camera screen while Celeste and her friends had breakfast. "What's that forest to the west of the path?" I asked. The three looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret at that moment. "Did you go there?" Celeste asked. "Only to the edge. I took photos from outside." Celeste shrugged with that gesture of hers that means she doesn't want to get into a topic. "The neighbors say that place is strange," she said. "They don't go there." "Strange how?" "I don't know. Country things. You know how those stories are." I didn't ask more, but I kept thinking about the forest for the rest of the day. That afternoon, while Celeste and her friends went to town to buy things for dinner, I returned to the trail with the camera. I wanted photos with the afternoon light, which in the mountains has a completely different tone than in the morning, more orange and more lateral, which makes the textures of the bark and leaves appear with a definition that the frontal midday light flattens. I reached the edge of the forest and started photographing from the outside, as I had in the morning. The photos were good, with that threshold quality that I had liked. But as the minutes passed and the light changed, I felt the urge to enter. Just a few meters, enough to photograph from the inside out, which is a completely different perspective. I entered. The change was immediate, not just in light, but in everything. The sound of the wind that had been present all afternoon disappeared the moment I crossed the threshold of the first trees. The air became stiller, denser, with a smell of damp earth, and something decaying plant-like that was not unpleasant but was very intense, too intense for the time of year. February in Cordoba is hot and dry. That smell belonged to another season, to another kind of humidity. I photographed outward, toward the light of the hill visible between the trunks, and the photos were exactly what I wanted. That feeling of being inside something dark looking out at a bright world. I moved forward a few more meters, searching for a better angle. It was then that I noticed the silence. Not the silence of the wind that had disappeared upon entering, but something more total. No birds, no insects, no rustling of branches. The forest was completely silent in a way that forests normally are not even the densest ones. Forests always have sound, the movement of small animals, the rustle of leaves, something. This had nothing. I noticed it, I registered it, and I archived it as interesting rather than concerning. I am one of those who feel curiosity before fear in the face of the unknown. I kept photographing. I had been inside the forest for maybe 15 minutes when I heard the first sound. It was a very soft sound, hard to locate, like footsteps on dry leaves, but too slow and too spaced out to be a small animal, and too light to be something big. They came from somewhere to my left, but when I turned in that direction, the sound seemed to come from another side. I stood still and listened. The footsteps, or whatever they were, stopped as well. I waited a minute, two, total silence. I kept walking, now with a bit more attention to my surroundings than before. The light outside was fading. Inside the forest, where it was already twilight at that hour, it was getting dark. I decided to start heading back. I walked in the direction I had entered, or at least in the direction I thought I had entered. The forest wasn't large. I had gone in about 20 or 30 meters, no more. I should have reached the edge in less than a minute. I didn't. I walked what seemed to me more than enough, and the forest continued around me, just as dense, without the clearing of the hill visible between the trunks. I turned 90 degrees and walked in that direction. Still nothing. I turned again. The forest remained the same in all directions. Dark trees, leaf-covered ground, increasing twilight. That's when I felt something akin to fear for the first time. Not panic, not yet, but an internal alarm. A signal that something was not right in the geometry of that place. I took out my phone to use the GPS. No signal, which was strange because in the Cordoba Mountains, although the signal is weak, there is almost always something. There was absolutely nothing there, not even a bar. I breathed. I thought logically, forests are not mazes. If I walk in a straight line in any direction, I will eventually come out. I chose a direction and walked with a determined stride, counting the steps to maintain a straight line. I reached 100 steps, and the forest remained the same. 200 steps, still the same. At 300 steps, I stopped. I was in the center of something that shouldn't be possible. A forest that, by its dimensions visible from the outside, couldn't be more than 100 meters in diameter but seemed to have no limit inside. It was at that moment of stopping when I saw it. Among the trees, about 20 meters away, there was a figure. An old man, standing completely still, looking at me. It was hard to see the details in the dim light, but I could make out the silhouette. Thin, standing straight despite the age, suggested by his white hair and posture, with something that could have been dark clothing or simply the shadow clinging to him too tightly. He did not greet me. He did not move. He was just there, looking at me. "Good afternoon," I said. My voice sounded strange in that silence, too present, too alone. The old man did not respond. "I got lost," I said. "Can you show me the way out?" Nothing. Motionless. I walked a few steps towards him. The old man remained unmoving, but something changed in the way I perceived him. As I got closer, his silhouette did not gain more detail. It remained just as blurry, just as vague, as if the distance between us was not changing even though I was clearly moving towards him. I stopped at what I estimated to be about 10 meters away. "Can you hear me?" The old man slowly raised an arm and pointed to my right. A clear gesture, without ambiguity. That direction. I don't know if it was smart or not, but I listened to him. I turned to the right and walked. After 50 steps, the forest opened up. I emerged at the edge, on the hill, into the light of the sunset, which by that time was almost orange and horizontal. I came out breathing harder than I had realized I was breathing, and I stopped with my hands on my knees for a few seconds, simply existing in the open space. When I straightened up and looked back towards the forest, there was no one. The old man was not at the edge. There was no visible figure among the trees. I walked back to the cabin without stopping. Celeste and her friends were already preparing dinner when I arrived. They looked at my face and Celeste immediately asked what had happened. I told her. The three listened in silence, without interrupting me. When I finished, one of Celeste's friends, named Patricia and from the area, said something that stuck with me. My grandmother always said that in that forest lives something that watches over the place, that it doesn't harm those who enter with good intentions, but it also doesn't let them leave alone, that you have to wait for it to show you the way. Watches over the place from what? I asked. Patricia shrugged. From the people who come to do harm, I suppose. Hunting without permission, cutting down trees, that kind of thing. My grandmother said that forest has been there long before the village and has its own way of protecting itself. And the old man? Who is the old man? The three of them looked at each other. My grandmother said that the old man is part of the forest. Patricia said that he is not a person, that he is the form the forest takes when it needs to communicate with someone. We ate in silence for a while after that. That night I didn't sleep well. Not because I was exactly afraid, but because my brain couldn't stop processing what I had experienced. The geometric impossibility of the forest, the total silence, the old man pointing without moving, the exit that appeared exactly where he indicated. I am a photographer. I work with visible reality, with the light that exists, with the objects that are there and that the lens captures. I have a very concrete relationship with the physical world, and what I had experienced in that forest did not correspond to anything I understood about how the physical world works. At 2 a.m, with the others asleep, I turned on the camera screen and reviewed the photos I had taken inside the forest. The photos from when I entered, the first ones I took photographing outward, were perfectly fine. Clear, correctly exposed, exactly what I remembered photographing. The photos I took afterward, the ones I took while walking in search of the exit, were something else. In several of them, among the trees, there was a shape. Not the old one I had seen from the front later, but something different. A dark blot, without a clear human form, that appeared in different positions in consecutive photos, as if it had moved between one photo and the next. In one photo, it was behind a thick trunk. In the next, it was to the left, closer. In the following one, it was directly behind me, captured because I had turned the camera looking for an angle. I looked at that last photo for a long time. The dark blot in that photo was less than 2 meters from where I had been standing, and I hadn't seen it. Hadn't felt anything behind me, hadn't had any indication that something was so close. I turned off the camera and sat in the darkness of the room for a long while. The next morning, Sunday, while Celeste and the others were still sleeping, I went to the trail, not to enter the forest, only to see it from the outside, from a distance, in the clean morning light. It looked exactly the same as the first day, dense, dark inside. That border between the light of the hill and the inner shadow that had seemed so photographically interesting to me 48 hours earlier. There was something different, however. At the edge of the forest, exactly where I had exited the previous afternoon, there was a stone, a medium-sized, smooth, dark gray stone that hadn't been there when I left. I'm sure of it because I would have seen it. I would have photographed it. It was exactly the kind of detail that I record. The stone was alone at the edge of the vegetation, as if placed there intentionally. I didn't touch it. I didn't photograph it. I looked at it for a moment and then turned around and went back to the cabin. When Celeste got up and I told her about the stone, her expression was that of someone who decides to talk about something they would rather not discuss. The first time I came to this cabin as a girl, she said, my mom told me that this forest was a place that deserved respect. That if one ever passed nearby, it was better not to enter. She didn't explain why. She just said it was a place that had its own rules. And the stone. I don't know what it means, but it seems to me that it's better to leave it where it is. We left it where it was. We left that Sunday at noon. On the way back to the city, while Celeste drove and the others dozed in the back seats, I was looking at the photos on the camera again, the ones from the forest. The photos of the dark spot were still there, just as clear, just as inexplicable. But there was something else I hadn't noticed the night before. In the photo where the spot was behind me, less than 2 meters away, if one looked closely towards the back, among the farthest trees, there was a much more defined shape. It was the old man, standing, among the trunks, looking towards the camera. I hadn't seen it at that moment. At that moment, I had only seen the stain up close, and I had turned looking for an angle, not knowing that further back, in the shadows, there was a completely still figure watching everything. I showed the photo to Celeste at a traffic light. She looked at it for a second, and then turned her eyes back to the road without saying anything. Celeste, I said. Yes, I saw it. What do you think? Silence for several seconds. I think you were lucky that it showed you the way out, she said in the end. I didn't respond. I put the camera in the backpack and looked out the window at the flat field that replaced the mountains as we moved away. I still have those photos. I didn't delete them, although there was a moment when I thought about doing it. I have them in a separate folder on the hard drive, with a file name that doesn't describe them, that says nothing about what they are. I look at them from time to time, not frequently, when I need to remember that reality has more layers than the camera can capture. I haven't returned to the mountains of Cordoba, not out of fear exactly, but because there are places one visits only once and knows it. The forest was one of those places. It let me in, showed me what it had to show, and let me out. I don't need to tempt a second visit. The gray stone I found at the edge of the forest that morning, I still remember with a strange clarity. Clearer, in fact, than many things I did photograph that weekend. As if the brain knows that some things matter, even if they don't remain in images. That's all Rodrigo wanted to tell. End of Rodrigo's story. He wrote to me that since that weekend he reviews his landscape photos more carefully, as he sometimes finds things in the backgrounds that he hadn't noticed while shooting. He says that most are normal shadows, reflections, branches that form shapes. But every so often there is something that doesn't fit, and in those cases, he simply closes the folder and continues with his day. I think it's a sensible way to live with certain experiences. If you ever photographed something that shouldn't be in the image, I would like to know. The comments are there for that. Take care. We'll talk in the next story. This story was sent to me by a listener who signs as Tomas from the north of Argentina. He wrote to me that he has been trying to find an explanation for 3 years and has already given up. What happened to him occurred when he was 40 years old, in a mountain hotel, where he stayed for just one night for work. One night was enough. If you have ever had an experience in a place that felt wrong from the very first moment, tell me about it below. Now, this is what Tomas experienced. I am a seller of agricultural machinery. I say this because it is relevant. My job consists of traveling routes, visiting producers, spending nights in hotels in towns that do not appear on most tourist maps. I have been doing this for 20 years. I have slept in places ranging from perfectly comfortable to barely tolerable, and throughout that time, I developed the capacity to adapt to any space without thinking too much about it. I enter, leave my suitcase, take a shower, sleep. The next morning I leave. Hotels are interchangeable rooms, nothing more. That's why what happened to me at the hotel in Cañada Oscura is so difficult for me to assimilate even now, 3 years later, because I am not suggestible. I do not seek these things. I had no reason for my mind to fabricate what I am about to describe. It was a Wednesday in July, a dry winter, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones, a clear and dark sky, like those seen only far from the cities. I was heading to a meeting with a big producer in a town that was 3 hours away, and the company's protocol in such cases is to stay the night before to arrive rested for the morning meeting. The GPS took me to Cañada Oscura, which was the closest town to the producer's field. I arrived around 9 at night. The town was small even by my standards, a main avenue with some closed shops, a gas station, a church, and the hotel. The hotel was simply called Hotel del Camino. It was a 2-story building, one of those constructed in the 70s that never quite decided whether to be functional or have character, and in the process it achieved neither. With a facade of exposed bricks, a sign with illuminated plastic letters, and a dirt parking lot in front where there were 3 other vehicles. I entered. The reception was a wooden counter with a lady in her 60s who looked up from the television when the doorbell rang. "Good evening, a room please." She handed me a form to fill out, processed my card, and gave me a key with a plastic keychain that had the number 12 written on it with a marker. "Second floor at the end of the corridor," she said. "Breakfast is from 7 to 9. "Thank you," I said. "Sir," she said as I was turning away. I stopped. "The heating in room 12 takes a while to warm up," he said. "Leave it on since you enter." "Understood," I said. I went up the stairs with the suitcase. The corridor on the second floor was long and narrow, with a carpet of a red that had been intense at some point, and that time had worn down to a dull brown. The walls had that wallpaper from the 80s, with a geometric pattern in colors that must have been modern 4 decades ago. The room doors were made of dark wood with brass numbers. I walked to the end. Room 12 was the last one in the corridor, against the back wall. I opened the door and entered. The room was what I expected. A double bed, a wardrobe, a table with a chair, an old television on a low cabinet, a small bathroom with the shower marked by lime. The cold inside was almost the same as outside. I found the heating thermostat on the wall next to the door and turned it up to the maximum, as the receptionist had instructed me. I left my suitcase, took a shower with water that took too long to heat up, put on my sleepwear, and got into bed. I had a meeting at 9 in the morning. I needed to sleep. The heating started to work slowly, with that pipe sound that old systems make, a metallic and rhythmic tapping that at first seems like it will be annoying, and then the brain incorporates it as background noise and ignores it. I fell asleep before 11. I woke up at 2:40 in the morning. I don't know what woke me up. There wasn't a specific noise that I could identify afterward. I just woke up suddenly, with that particular feeling of alertness that one has when something in the environment changes while sleeping and the brain detects it before consciousness does. The room was dark. The heating was still running, the constant metallic tapping. The temperature had risen enough that the cold was no longer aggressive. I lay still in bed, staring at the ceiling, letting my consciousness finish waking up. I didn't feel anything particularly abnormal, just the state of alertness without a specific object that sometimes comes with a sudden awakening in an unfamiliar place. Then I heard the breathing. It was slow, regular, the rhythm of someone asleep, or someone who wants to seem asleep, and it was coming from the chair in the corner, next to the table, about 2 meters from the bed. I got up in bed very slowly, trying not to make any noise, and looked towards the corner. In the darkness I could make out the silhouette of the chair, and on the chair there was something sitting. I couldn't see details. It was too dark for that. But the silhouette was unmistakable, something that occupied the space of the chair, with a volume that corresponded to that of a person sitting, with what seemed to be a head slightly inclined forward, like someone sleeping sitting up. I remained absolutely still. The breathing continued, slow, regular, without variation. I reached out my arm towards the nightstand, searching for the lamp switch. I found it and pressed it. The room was illuminated with the dim light of the nightstand lamp. The chair was empty. I kept looking at it for a time I couldn't measure. The simple wooden chair, with the straight back, completely empty. The table behind, with the glass of water that I had placed there before falling asleep, intact. I listened. Silence, except for the heating. I got up and checked the bathroom. Empty. The closet. Empty. I looked under the bed. Nothing. The room's door was still locked from the inside, the security chain on as I had left it. There was no one. I sat on the edge of the bed with the lamp on and tried to think calmly. It was possible that I had been half asleep and that the darkness and a particular angle of the shadows had created an illusion. It was possible that the breathing I had heard was a sound from the heating or the building that my sleepy brain had interpreted differently. Everything was possible. I lay back down with the lamp on and took a long time to fall asleep again. When I did, I dreamed. In the dream, I was in the same room, but it was different. Older, with different furniture, with wallpaper that was not the same. There was a window where I remembered there being a wall, and through that window, a light came in that did not correspond to any time of day. In the corner chair there was a man sitting. I saw him from behind. He was older, with white hair and the hunched posture of someone who has carried weight for a long time. He wore clothes that were not from this era, that kind of work clothing that men from the countryside wore 50 or 60 years ago. He did not move. In the dream, I approached him with that particular logic of dreams, where one does things that one wouldn't do while awake. I walked until I was right behind him, and he spoke without turning around. "You shouldn't be in this room," he said. The voice was old and dry, like paper that crumbles. "Why?" I asked in the dream. "Because this room is already occupied," he said. I woke up. It was daytime. Light came through the blinds, and the lamp on the bedside table remained on, pale and useless against the morning light. The phone clock read 7:15. I got up, took a shower, got dressed, and went down for breakfast. The lady at the reception also attended to the dining room. There were two other people having breakfast at separate tables, men who looked similar to me, travelers or workers passing through. I had coffee and croissants at a table by the window and looked at the main street of the town that was beginning to wake up with the slowness of small places in winter. When the lady came to offer me more coffee, I made the decision to ask her. "A question," I said. "Room 12. Does it have anything particular?" She looked at me. "Particular in what sense?" "In any sense," I said. "Is there anything I should know about that room?" The lady placed the coffee pot on the table with more care than was necessary. "Why do you ask?" "Because I woke up at 3 in the morning thinking there was someone in the room." She didn't respond immediately. She looked towards the other tables, as if checking that the other customers weren't listening. "Did you see anything?" she asked in a lower voice. "A silhouette in the chair. When I turned on the light, there was nothing." The woman nodded slowly, with the expression of someone who is not surprised, but wasn't expecting to have this conversation. "That room has a history," she said. "It's not something we put on the sign, as you can understand." "What kind of history?" She hesitated. "The hotel is 40 years old, but the building is older than that. Before it was a hotel, it was other things. And before that, on the land, there was a house. In that house, in the room that is now 12, a man died a long time ago. Alone, in a chair. He was found days later. Who was he? An old man who lived alone. He had no family here. No one really knows where he came from or how long he had been in the town. The old folks say he was a strange man, who didn't talk to anyone, who went out little. And since then, since the hotel has been operating as such, there have been guests who complain about 12, she said. Not all, not always, but every so often someone comes down in the morning with that face you have now. Why do they keep using that room?" She looked at me with something that could have been shame or could have been resignation. "Because most of the time nothing happens," he said. "And because the hotel has few rooms and we can't afford to leave one empty permanently." I paid for breakfast, went up to get the suitcase, and when I entered the room for the last time to make sure I wasn't leaving anything behind, I paused at the door for a moment and looked at the chair. It was just a wooden chair in the corner of a hotel room. But as I looked at it, I remembered the voice from the dream. That old dry voice. "This room is already occupied." I took the suitcase and left. The meeting went well. The producer signed the order I needed, and I returned home that same afternoon by a different route, avoiding Cañada Oscura, even though it added 40 minutes to the trip. I don't know if what I saw in that room was the ghost of the man who died there decades earlier. I don't know if dreams can be visits or if they are just the brain processing what it absorbed during the day. I'm not the kind of person who needs these things to have a label in order to carry them. What I do know is that since that night, when I arrive at a hotel and enter the room, the first thing I do before leaving the suitcase is look at the chair, just to make sure it's empty. So far, it always is. So far, that's all Tomas wanted to share. He told me that he never stayed in that town again, and has no plans to do so. I completely understand why. If you've had an experience in a hotel or a transient place that you never quite figured out, I would love to read it in the comments. Those brief stories are sometimes the ones that weigh the most. And if you stayed listening until now, subscribe to keep receiving more testimonies like Tomas's. Good night. We'll hear from you in the next story. There are people who write to me asking that I do not reveal their full name, and there are others who specifically ask me to do so, who want their story to circulate with their name because they feel it gives them a bit of control over something that took away a lot from them. Marcos is one of the latter. He is 52 years old, a musician, and lives in Buenos Aires. He wrote to me 3 weeks ago with a story that, in his own words, he has been carrying alone for 8 years. If you have ever had something to carry alone for too long, you already know how heavy that is. Marcos talks about a violin, about what he found inside that violin, and about what came with it to his apartment one night in March 8 years ago and took much longer to leave. This is what he told me. I have been playing the violin since I was 9 years old. I'm not saying this to show off or to establish credentials. I'm saying it because it's important to understand that I know the instruments in the way one knows things they've had in their hands for decades. I know their weight, their temperature, the specific sound each one makes when you tune it and when you detune it, the way the varnish ages, and the way the wood responds to the climate. I've held violins from the 18th century and violins made the previous week, and I can tell you differences that aren't written in any manual but in the tips of my fingers. With that experience, I arrived at the San Telmo Instrument Fair on a Saturday in March, with no particular plan other than to look, and I came home with the Guarneri. That's what I called it from the beginning, even though it wasn't a Guarneri. It was impossible for it to be a Guarneri. An instrument from that maker is worth what I won't earn in several years of work, and what the man selling it asked for was an amount I could pay without my hand trembling. But it had something in the wood that reminded me of the Guarneris I had been lucky enough to see up close during my years of study. A depth in the tone of the varnish, an asymmetry in the F-holes that seemed made by someone who understood that calculated imperfection is its own kind of perfection. I asked the seller where it came from. He said he had received it as part of payment for something, that he didn't know its history, and that if I wanted it, I could buy it, and if not, I could leave it. I bought it. The man didn't give me a case. The violin was wrapped in a dark, soft cloth, the kind used for old instruments. I unwrapped it right there to check it. The wood was in good condition, the pegs responded well, the bridge was slightly crooked, but it was a minor adjustment. There was something inside. I saw it when I tilted the instrument towards the light. A paper, folded, wedged behind the soundbar. I tried to pull it out with my fingers but couldn't. The seller, who had already forgotten about me, glanced at me for a second when I tilted it. I asked him if he knew what that paper was. He said, "I didn't take it out. You do whatever you want." I took the violin home. That night, with good light and a long watchmaker's tweezers, I pulled out the paper. It was a document. Handwritten, in a script I would recognize as from the early 20th century, if not earlier, in Spanish with some words that are no longer used, or that are used differently. It had no date. It was signed with a name I will not repeat here because there are things I learned that are better left unspoken or unwritten. It was a kind of declaration that the author, the signer, ceded something to the instrument. His words were confusing in parts, but the general sense was that a delivery, something given in exchange for something received. The last line said, and these I copy exactly because they are etched in my mind: "What lives in the wood is mine as long as I live. When I am no longer here, it is yours. May he who touches it know that he is not alone." I kept the paper. I told myself it was a historical curiosity, the kind of thing an eccentric musician from another century had tucked inside his instrument as an artistic statement or as a private joke. I went to sleep. That night I dreamed of music. It was not a melody I knew or had composed. It was something that came from outside the dream, if that makes sense. A music that I heard but did not play, that arrived from somewhere behind the images of the dream like a separate audio track. It was beautiful, I must say, in a way that generated something between admiration and discomfort, like the beauty of certain things that one senses they shouldn't find beautiful. I woke up at 3 in the morning. The apartment was silent. I poured myself some water in the kitchen, and on my way back to the bedroom, I passed through the living room where I had left the violin on the dining table. I stopped. The violin was in the same place where I had left it, but the pegs were in different positions. Not all of them, just 2, the E and A. I had tuned them that afternoon and now they were moved. Not much, but enough for the tuning to be slightly altered. I told myself that the changes in nighttime temperature could move the pegs of an old instrument. It's true that this happens. I told myself it was that. I went back to bed. I closed my eyes. And I heard, for perhaps 2 seconds from the living room, a note. Just one. Long, sustained in the register of E. I remained motionless for several minutes. Not repeated. Just that note, suspended in the silence of the apartment, and then nothing. The next day I called my daughter Rebecca. She lives alone a few blocks from my apartment, and we often work together. Her as a pianist, me as a violinist, in small ensembles and private events. I told her about the new violin, the paper inside, the note from the night. She listened to me with the mix of affection and impatience she uses when she thinks I'm being dramatic. She told me that the note was probably a contraction of the wood, that old papers inside instruments were more common than they seemed, and that if the instrument sounded good, I should take advantage of it. I agreed with her. We hung up, but I started playing the violin that very afternoon, and what came out stopped me. It was perfect, and that, for someone who has been playing for more than 4 decades, has a specific meaning. It's not that I play poorly, it's not false modesty, but there is a level of technique where one knows exactly the limits of their own hands, what they can produce and what they cannot. And that day, with that instrument, I was producing something that was beyond my usual limits. Passages that normally took me effort were flowing out with a fluency that wasn't mine. Nuances that took me years to develop were coming effortlessly, without thinking about them. It was as if the instrument knew where I wanted to go before I even decided. I played for 3 straight hours. When I stopped, I realized that I hadn't stopped out of exhaustion, but because something inside the instrument, or inside me, or in both, decided that it was enough for that day. That feeling, that the decision wasn't entirely mine, was the first thing that caused me real and sustained discomfort. During the following week, I played every day. The music that came out was still extraordinary. I began to compose pieces that surprised me while I played them, as if I were receiving them instead of creating them. In the 30 years I've been composing, I had never experienced anything like this with such consistency. Music that arrived complete, without the construction work that it normally implies, without the versions and corrections and discards. It just arrived, and it was good. It was better than anything I had done before. But the apartment was starting to feel different. It's hard to describe accurately. It wasn't that something had changed physically. The furniture was in its place. The temperature was normal. There were no strange smells or noises. It was something more in the atmosphere, in the quality of the air, like when you enter a room where 2 people have just had a tense conversation and have already left. The furniture is there, the chair is there, but something of the exchange lingers in the space. That's how my apartment felt, as if there was always someone who had just left or was about to enter. Celso, my neighbor from downstairs, rang my doorbell one Tuesday morning. He was a man in his 60s, retired, calm, the kind of neighbor you have for years without knowing his name and then discover he is the most reasonable person in the building. He told me he wanted to tell me something but didn't know how I would take it. I told him to go ahead. He said that the night before, around 2 in the morning, he had heard music, violin, coming from my apartment. And it was beautiful, he clarified. He wasn't complaining about the noise, but he wanted to know if I was okay because there was something in that music that had kept him from sleeping, not because of the volume, but because of the feeling it gave him, like listening to something one shouldn't be listening to. I told him I hadn't played anything the night before, that I'd gone to bed at 11 and hadn't gotten up. Celso looked at me for a moment and then said, "Then maybe it was something else." He didn't clarify what he meant by that and left. That night I put the violin inside the case I had bought for it and carefully closed the zipper, placing it at the back of the bedroom closet. I told myself I needed to keep it away for a few days, that perhaps I was spending too many hours playing, and that was affecting my perception of things. I went to bed early. At 1:45 in the morning, I was awakened by the music. It was the violin. I recognized it immediately because it was my instrument, my sound, and because the piece being played was one of those I had composed that week. The case was closed. I heard it clearly from the bedroom. The bow on the strings, the nuances, the changes in position. It was perfect. The same perfection I produced when I played it during the day, but with something additional that I couldn't name until later, an element in the sound that wasn't technical but of another nature, as if someone were playing with an emotion that the human body doesn't exactly produce. I got up. I opened the closet. The case was closed. The music continued. I opened the case. The violin was there, still, with the bow beside it. The music stopped at the exact moment I opened the case. Not at the end of a phrase, not with a cadence, in the middle of a note. I sat on the bedroom floor with the open case in front of me for a time I couldn't measure. Then I called Rebecca. It was 2 in the morning. She answered scared because I never call at that hour. I told her I needed her to come. She asked what was wrong. I didn't know exactly what to say. I told her the violin plays by itself. There was a silence on the other end of the line. Then she said, "I'm coming." Rebecca arrived in 20 minutes. She checked the case, checked the violin, checked the apartment with that mix of worry and skepticism that she has. She didn't hear anything that night. She stayed until 4 in the morning and left convinced that I had dreamed the music or that the sound was coming from some other floor of the building. I told her it was fine. I was left alone. I spent the following days trying to document what was happening. I recorded with my phone for several nights. In 3 of the recordings there is something, not complete music but loose, brief notes, the kind one would produce if passing the bow with very little pressure on the strings. But the bow was in the case. I checked it every morning. The case was always closed. The violin was always inside. The more intense dreams also began. It was no longer just background music. Now there was a figure in the dreams, always on the periphery, always turned away or in profile, never facing forward. They wore dark clothing from another era. They had a violin under their arm. And in the dreams I knew, with that irrational certainty of dreams, that this figure had been the previous owner of the instrument. Not the seller at the fair, the true owner, the signer of the paper. I went to see Father Ignacio. I am not a practitioner. My relationship with the church is that of someone who went to Mass as a child and then drifted away without drama or resentment. But Father Ignacio was an elderly priest whom I had known for years through a mutual friend, and he was known to be someone who listened without judging the stories that other priests dismissed. I went to his church one Wednesday afternoon and found him organizing books in the sacristy. I asked him for a moment. He gave it to me. I told him everything. The paper inside the violin, the text of the declaration, the nighttime music, the dreams, the figure. Father Ignacio listened without interrupting me even once. When I finished, he closed the book he had in his hands and asked me, "Did you play that instrument after reading the paper?" I told him yes. He nodded slowly as if that confirmed something he already suspected. He told me that what I was describing had characteristics of what in certain traditions is called an invocation bond by object. Someone had made a pact that tied a presence to that instrument with specific conditions of transfer, and by playing the violin I had activated that bond unknowingly. He told me that it was not necessarily a malevolent presence, that such pacts were sometimes made for reasons that the signer considered legitimate, often related to talent, with the desire to continue something beyond death. But that such a bond had consequences that accumulated over time, that the presence began to take up space, that the object became a door always ajar. I asked him what I could do. He thought for a moment. Then he asked me if I had the paper. I told him yes, that I had kept it. He told me to bring the paper and the violin, that there was a way to close that bond, which involved a blessing of the instrument and the destruction of the paper, but that for it to work I had to make a decision, that if we closed the bond, the instrument would become just an instrument again, that the perfection I had experienced while playing it would leave with its presence. That part cost me more than I expected. Spending a week playing with that quality, producing that music, had left a mark. It was like having tasted something and knowing that when you returned it, you wouldn't forget the flavor. I told Father Ignacio that I needed to think about it. He said he understood, but that I shouldn't wait too long, that bonds of that kind tended to deepen over time. I returned to the apartment. I sat in front of the closed case for a long time. I thought about the signer of the paper, about what he had wanted, for his music to continue, for what lived in the wood not to die with him. I thought that in a way he had succeeded, that I had played his music, that I had heard it in dreams, that somehow he had managed to have someone else receive it. But I also thought about Celso, who had not been able to sleep, about Rebecca, who had come scared at 2 in the morning, about the nights I had spent awake listening, about the feeling that my apartment had an occupant that I had not invited. I went to Father Ignacio the next day with the paper and the violin. The process seemed simple. A prayer, holy water over the instrument, the paper burned in a metal bowl while Father Ignacio recited something in Latin that I couldn't follow. It lasted perhaps 20 minutes. The paper took a while to burn. The flame flickered on and off several times before it held, which Father Ignacio observed without comment, but with visible attention. When the paper finished burning, he returned the violin to me, told me to take care of it, that it was a beautiful instrument, and that if he noticed anything again, I should let him know. I returned to the apartment. That night I slept without dreams, or if there were any, I don't remember them. The apartment felt different. That residue of presence that I had learned to recognize was no longer there. It was simply my apartment. with the normal silence of a fifth-floor flat in the early morning and the distant traffic of the avenue. The next day I took the violin and played. It was a good instrument, better than most I have had, but that was all it was, an instrument. The supernatural perfection of the previous week was not there. My hands were my hands, with their known limitations and their technique built over decades. I played for an hour and what came out was good, solid, mine. I stared at the violin when I finished, with a feeling that took me a while to identify but that I could ultimately only describe as mourning. A small, private, somewhat absurd mourning for something I should never have wanted to keep. I still keep the violin. I play with it at some concerts. No one who listens to me notices any difference with my other instruments. And I play well, as I have always played, as I learned to play over 40 years. But sometimes, very occasionally on winter nights when the apartment is completely silent, I think I hear something. Not music, just a presence in the air, brief, like someone passing through a hallway without stopping. And I don't know if it's an echo of what was there, or if Father Ignacio was right that what we did was enough to close the door, or if there are doors that can be closed but not completely sealed. That's what I have to share. The violin is fine, I am fine. And that music I received that week, that music that came without asking for it, I wrote it all down before returning it. It's kept in my notebook. I play it from time to time, with my hands and my limits, and without anyone's help. I guess I had to hold on to something. End of Marcos's testimony. He told me at the end of his message that the notebook with those compositions really exists, and that someday he might record them, and that when he does, he won't be able to avoid thinking about who really composed them. What stays with me most from his story is that question he asks himself at the end, whether there are doors that close completely or if there is always a crack left. I have no answer to that. But if you ever had an object that you felt carried something more than its physical weight, I would love for you to share it with me in the comments. Every story you share reminds me that there is so much we still cannot name. Sleep well tonight. We'll talk soon. Have you ever arrived at a place where from the very first moment you felt that it didn't want you there? Not in a hostile or violent way, but in that silent manner, like when you enter a room and something in the air tells you that you don't belong. That was exactly what Isabel felt from the first day she arrived at the sidewalk where she was going to teach. Isabel is 28 years old, she is a teacher, and she wrote to me from a municipality in the south of Colombia just over a month ago. Her message was long, very detailed, and it was clear that she had kept it inside for a long time. If you also have something stored that you would like me to narrate here, write to me. Now, let me tell you what happened to Isabel during the semester she spent living on the edge of the mountain and why she never walked alone after sunset again. I never thought I would end up requesting a transfer before the year was over. When I was assigned to the La Oscurana pathway, I read the name on the paper and felt something I couldn't quite name at that moment. Not exactly fear, more like an unease, like when you pronounce a word that doesn't quite sound right even though you don't know why. La Oscurana. I asked the coordinator of the education department if that was the official name or a nickname. She told me it was the official name, that it had appeared on all maps for over 100 years, and not to worry, that it was a quiet pathway, that the school was small but in good condition, and that the parents were cooperative. I signed the papers. I packed my things. I left. The path was 2 hours from the town center by an unpaved road that the public truck traveled 3 times a week. What wasn't on the papers was that the school was another 20 minutes on foot from where the truck dropped off the passengers, along a horse path that bordered the mountain. I found out when I arrived and asked the driver how to get there. He pointed towards the mountain and said to me, "Take that path. Go straight and don't stray." Those last 4 words he said with an emphasis that didn't match the casual tone of the rest of the directions. He didn't clarify them. He left. The school was exactly as they had described to me. Small, with unpainted block walls, a zinc roof, 2 classrooms, and a small room in the back that served as housing for the teacher. The principal's name was Sophia. She was about 40 years old, had a friendly face, and always busy hands. She welcomed me with coffee and efficiently showed me around, like someone who has already received several city teachers who arrive with scared faces and leave before the first month is over. I asked her how many students there were. She told me 19, from 1st to 5th grade. all in the same classroom with her while I attended to the other group. I asked her how many teachers had passed through that position in recent years. She looked at me for a moment before answering. Some. She didn't add anything else, and I decided not to ask further either. The first week was normal. The children were shy at first but curious, and by the third day, they were already asking me questions that were hard to answer and bringing me fruits and corn that their mothers sent as a welcome. I made the horse path twice a day, morning and afternoon, and the mountains on the sides were dense and green and smelled of damp earth and something floral that I couldn't identify. In the afternoons, when I returned to the village to do the shopping I needed before the store closed, the path felt different under the low light of sunset. The shadows among the trees were deeper. The sounds of the mountains changed register. But I told myself it was just the effect of the hour, that it was natural for a forest path to feel different at night than during the day, and I kept walking. It was the second week when I started to notice the small things. The first was the silence. Not the comfortable silence one associates with the countryside, but a sudden and total silence that fell over the road at certain moments, as if everything living in the woods had decided to fall silent at the same time. Birds, insects, the wind among the leaves, everything cut off abruptly for 30 or 40 seconds, and then gradually resumed. It happened 3 times that week, always in the same stretch of the road, right where a huge tree with exposed roots marked a bend. The second thing was harder to rationalize. One morning upon arriving at school, I found on the entrance step a small figure made of intertwined branches. It was crude but deliberate. It had a human shape, with limbs tied with plant fiber and what seemed to be human hair tangled on top. It wasn't animal hair. It was smooth and dark, the kind that children from the area have. I asked Sophia if she knew what it was. She looked at it for a second with an expression I couldn't quite read, then picked it up and threw it behind the school without saying anything. I pressed her. What was it? She told me, "Things from the woods. Don't pay it any mind." That answer seemed insufficient to me, but the tone in which she said it made it clear that I wasn't going to get more information that way. I casually asked the children during a class if they knew which wild animals to be careful of. Several answered, snakes, wasps, the bull from Mr. Fermin's farm. Then a third-grade girl named Paola, who had the most serious eyes I have seen in an 8-year-old, said without anyone asking her directly, "And the goblins." The other children fell silent in a way that did not seem like the normal reaction to a curious answer, but rather something more akin to deference. I asked Paola what she knew about goblins. She told me, "They live in the wild. If you look at them, they follow you home. And they pull the hair of girls with braids." She touched her own braids as she said it. I noticed that all the children had short hair, or it was neatly tied up. That afternoon, on my way back along the horseshoe path, I pushed thoughts of goblins and branch figures into a corner of my mind and told myself they were local legends, part of the area's culture, the kind of stories passed down from generation to generation to keep children close to home. Just like the bogeyman or the man with the sack. Beliefs that didn't deserve me, with my studies in pedagogy and my urban mentality, giving them more weight than they had. But at that very moment, just as I passed by the tree with exposed roots, silence fell. This time it lasted longer, perhaps a full minute. And during that minute, in the woods to my left, about 10 meters among the trees, I heard something I had not heard before, a laugh, not an adult's. It was high-pitched, short, like the laugh of a small child laughing at something private, and it came from deep in the woods, where there was no path and where no child should have been at that hour. I walked faster without running, which was the unspoken instruction that the body gives itself in those moments to not admit that it is afraid. I arrived at the store. I bought what I needed. I returned to school along the path with still enough light to see well. I didn't hear anything else. That night I wrote to my mom in the chat. I asked her if she remembered stories about goblins from when she was a child. She replied with several enthusiastic audio messages about the goblin that supposedly scared a neighbor in the neighborhood when she was 12 years old. It wasn't exactly the information I was looking for, but the sound of her voice helped me sleep. The third week, the dreams started. They were not nightmares in the conventional sense. There were no chases or monsters. It was always the same scenario, the horse path, at night, with a light that had no identifiable source, a kind of gray brightness that covered everything. I walked along that path and knew, with that certainty that only dreams have, that I must not stop. And on the hillside, On both sides, there were presences that I did not see directly but perceived in the periphery, like shadows moving among the trees in rhythm with my steps. I never reached any destination in the dream. I just walked, and the presences followed me. I always woke up before dawn, with the feeling that the room was cold despite the heat outside, and with a smell in the air that took me several days to identify. It was the same floral scent from the path, the one I had not managed to name, but more concentrated, as if someone had entered the room carrying it on their clothes. One day, while checking my hair in the morning, I found a knot. Not the kind that forms when you move while sleeping. It was a deliberate, tight knot in a specific strand, like the one made intentionally with fingers. I untangled it with difficulty. The next day, there was another one in a different strand. I tied my hair up before sleeping. The next morning, the updo was undone, and there were 2 new knots. I went to talk to Sophia. This time she did answer me, but we sat outside under the school's eaves, and she spoke softly even though there was no one nearby. She told me that the goblins of that mountain were something the inhabitants of La Oscurana had known forever, that there were families who had been living alongside them for generations by following certain rules, not entering the mountain after sunset, not imitating their laughter or whistling at them, not looking directly at the trees when movement was heard. She told me that the goblins had a special interest in young women with long hair, that they would pull their hair while they slept as a way of getting attention, and that if one responded to that call, if one sought them out in the mountain instead of ignoring them, things could get complicated. I asked her what it meant to complicate things. She said that they follow you wherever you go, that you start to hear them even when you're not near the mountain, and that if you go into the mountain at night looking for them, sometimes you don't come out. I asked her if she had seen them. She looked me straight in the eyes and said, "I was born here. I learned the rules since I was a child. You arrived 3 weeks ago and they are already noticing you." Then she stood up and walked into the room as if the conversation was over. That same afternoon, as I was leaving school towards the village, I encountered an old man on the road whom I had not seen before. He was sitting on a stone at the edge of the path, wearing a straw hat and with a machete crossed over his knees, looking at the mountains with the expression of someone who has been staring at the same thing for a long time. He greeted me as I passed and called me by my name, even though I had not told him. I asked him how he knew my name. He said, "Everyone knows who the new teacher is." He introduced himself as Don Aurelio. He asked me if I had trouble sleeping. I said yes. He nodded as if he expected it. He told me to stay for a moment and listen to what he wanted to tell me. Don Aurelio told me what no document from the education department mentioned about La Oscurana, that the name came from the first families that settled there, who called it that because the hill bordering the path had a particular darkness even during the day, a density that the light did not fully penetrate. That in that hill lived something that the old people simply called the thing from the hill, which could take the form of animals or small children to approach people, and that had a special appetite for newcomers, for those who did not know the rules. That there was a woman who lived on the edge of the hill, further inside the official path, who was the only person who had learned to speak with that thing from the hill, and that when things got complicated for someone, that woman could help. I asked him who that woman was. Don Aurelio said his name in such a low voice that I barely heard it. Transito. He told me that she wasn't exactly a person from the village, that she had been living on that edge of the mountain for more years than anyone could remember, and that going to see her at night was a bad idea, but that during the day I could find her by following the official path a little beyond where it ended, towards where the trees began to close in. He said that if I wanted things to return to normal, for the knots in my hair and the dreams and the laughter among the trees to stop, it might be worth going. I went to the store, did my shopping, and returned to school. That night the dreams were more intense. The presences in the dream mountain were closer to the path. They no longer just moved among the trees but stopped at the edge, right where the darkness began and the gray light ended, and they looked at me. I couldn't see their faces, only their silhouettes, small, the height of 5 or 6-year-old children, with a rigidity in their posture that was not childish at all. I woke up at 4 in the morning. The room smelled intensely of that mountain perfume. And in the silence of that hour, with complete clarity, I heard from outside the window, just a few meters away, the laughter, the same as on the path. Sharp, short, repeated twice. I remained motionless in bed until dawn. The next day, a Saturday, there were no classes. I told Sophia that I was going to walk along the path for a while. She asked me how far. I told her maybe as far as the official path went. She looked at me for a second and said, "Are you going to look for transito?" I said maybe. She nodded with a slowness that seemed resigned to me. She said, "Go in the morning, before noon, and don't accept anything to eat or drink that she offers you." I thanked her. She didn't say anything else. I left at 8 in the morning. The path was bathed in light and the birds sounded normal and the forest smelled of wet earth from the previous night's rain. I told myself it was a beautiful place, that under normal circumstances I would be one of those walkers who seek exactly this, silence and green and clean air. I passed the tree with exposed roots. There was no sudden silence. I continued. Beyond where the official road ended, there was a narrow, barely marked path that led into the trees. I followed it for 10 minutes, with light filtering through the foliage in slanted rays that made the space within the woods brighter than I would have expected. And then I saw the cabin. It was small, made of dark wood, with a roof covered in moss. It had a narrow porch with a couple of dry leather chairs. And in one of those chairs, as if she had been waiting for me, sat a woman. She was very old. One of those old ages that have no precise age, that could be 80 years or 120. She had white hair tied in braids, which seemed significant to me, although I couldn't say why. Her eyes were a light color that didn't match the dark tone of her skin, a color between gray and green that the mountain light made strange. She looked at me with the same expression as Don Aurelio by the roadside, without surprise. She said to me, "Isabel." Not as a question, but as a confirmation. I said yes. I told her that I had been told she could help me. She indicated for me to sit in the other chair. I remembered what Sophia had told me, and when she moved inside the ranch, I assumed to bring something. I told her I didn't want anything, that I had had breakfast. She returned without bringing anything, sat down, and asked me what I had seen and heard. I told her everything. The silences along the way, the figure of branches, the laughter among the trees, the knots in the hair, the dreams, the laughter outside the window. She listened without interrupting me, with her hands on her knees and her eyes somewhere between my eyes and the mountain behind me. When I finished, she remained silent for a while that felt long to me. Then she told me that the mountain had already marked me, that when something from the mountain marks someone, especially a newcomer, that person either needs to leave or someone needs to negotiate for them. That leaving without doing anything meant taking them along, that they didn't stay in the mountain but continued on, that in the city they were confused with dreams or stress or mental health issues, but that they didn't leave, and that staying without doing anything wasn't an option either because the interest increased over time. I asked her what negotiating entailed. She explained to me with the patience of someone who has explained the same thing many times, that the mountain was not evil in the sense that people understood it, that it did not want to harm her but functioned as a sustained attention, like when a wild animal gets used to a person and starts to follow them, that the negotiation was simple. I had to leave something at the edge of the mountain, something that was mine, something personal, and that served as a boundary, as a way of telling it that this was where my space ended and to respect that edge, that she would accompany me to the tree with exposed roots, which was the point where the mountain had started to notice me, and that I had to leave the object without looking towards the mountain while doing so. I asked her what kind of object. She said, "Something that you use close to your body, that has your scent." I was wearing a thread bracelet that my mom had given me when I graduated from university. I had worn it without taking it off for 4 years. I showed her the bracelet. Transito looked at it and nodded. We walked back together along the path to the official road. She walked with a dark wooden cane and a pace that was not slow but also not what I would have expected from someone her age. We didn't talk during the journey. When we reached the tree with exposed roots, she stopped a few meters from the tree and indicated for me to approach alone. She said quietly, "Place the bracelet on a root. Don't look towards the mountain, and don't say anything while you do it." I approached the tree. The smell of the mountain was intense there, that mix of damp and floral that I already knew well. I crouched down and placed the bracelet on a root that stuck out of the ground like an arch. The earth beneath was soft and dark. I kept my eyes on my hands and on the root and on the earth. I didn't look towards the mountain, but I listened. It was the first silence, the usual one, that total cutoff. And then, during that silence, something approached. I didn't see it. I only heard it. Footsteps on the dry leaves of the forest floor. Light, irregular, like someone who doesn't weigh much. They stopped a few meters from where I was, and there was a breath, barely audible, curious. I got up. I walked back to Transito without running, with all the calm I could muster. She looked at me when I reached her side and said, "Good." We started walking back to school. There was no sudden silence during that journey. The birds sounded all the way. That night I slept differently, deeply, without dreams. Or if there were any, I don't remember them. The room didn't smell of anything strange. In the morning, I checked my hair. No tangles. A week passed, then another. The bridle path was just a path. The mountain on the sides was just a mountain. The children continued to take care of their hair. The mothers kept sending fruits as a thank you. And Sophia would occasionally look at me with an expression that I learned to interpret as, "Is everything okay?" To which I would respond by nodding. I didn't go looking for Transito again. I don't know if that was the right thing to do. Sometimes I think I should have asked her more questions. That there were things she knew that she didn't tell me because I didn't ask them. Who she was exactly. How long she had been on that edge of the mountain. What she had negotiated herself to stay there all those years without anything from the mountain bothering her. At the end of that semester, I requested the transfer. Not out of fear, or not just because of that. It was because La Oscurana demanded a type of attention and an adaptation that I wasn't sure I could sustain. There are people who are born in those places and learn their rules from childhood and carry them in their bodies naturally. I was not that person, and it's better to recognize it in time than to stay until something you don't fully understand decides that it has spent enough time watching. My transfer was approved for the following academic year. The last time I walked along the horseshoe path, I looked at the tree with exposed roots as I passed. The bracelet was no longer there. I suppose the water or the wind took it, or some animal found it, or maybe something else took it away. I don't want to know which of the three options is correct. That's all I can tell, or all I'm willing to share for now. And there ends Isabel's testimony. She wrote to me at the end of the message that she still misses the children from La Oscurana, especially Paula, the one with the serious eyes who knew more than an 8-year-old should know. What stays with me the most from her story is that image of something from the woods that simply notices you without malice, like an attention that no one asked for and doesn't know how to turn off by itself. If you know stories from your region about goblins, entities from the woods, or places with rules that no one wrote but everyone respects, tell me about them in the comments. I love it when you share that kind of tales. Have a peaceful night. And if you live near a forest, don't look between the trees when you hear movement. We'll talk soon.